The Marvel Cinematic Universe is filled to the brim with diverse heroes, villains, aliens, and everyday characters that have their own stories and superpowers to show and tell. Which is why when our course was set the Organic Forms module, solely focusing on the MCU, I was rather excited to see what things I could do. Our task was to create a game-ready, sculpted character using industry-standard techniques and software that resided within the expansive boundaries of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, whether that was a hero, a villain, or otherwise. Many ideas flew through my head. I always find villains and their motives in stories interesting, such as Thanos' sinister plan with the Infinity Gauntlet. One character that came to mind was Bucky Barnes, more commonly known as the Winter Soldier. I've always found Bucky's intimidating look fascinating, and while Bucky was a great idea, I did not feel confident in my abilities with asymmetrical characters or as much hair sculpting as Bucky would require. I then settled on my next idea, the Hydra Soldier. Hydra are the World War II villains who face off against Captain America and the Allies in Captain America: The First Avenger, with incredibly eerie and intimidating masks and outfits which scream textbook evil. I always thought these guys looked super cool, and I wanted to shine a light on the more common foot soldiers of Red Skull's army, rather than a well-known villain such as the Winter Soldier. I began to collect various screenshots, images, and artwork depicting my chosen character for my PureRef mood board, which in truth was difficult. The Hydra Soldier design I wanted to go for was this pilot design seen in the final act of the film, but shots of these characters are scarce. I was having to rely on low quality, non-full body shots from the film, which I then brightened in Photoshop to try and get a good look at the design. Despite this slight bump in the road, I used other artwork and different designs for the Hydra Soldier outfits to attempt to come up with a mashup of all different ones and piece together what I could not see. This is where I began to draw up my concept art, including a pose and modelled weapon I sadly did not get the time to implement. I wanted the pose to be like some of the character poses seen in 2021's Halo Infinite, and the weapon was the same pistol used by Red Skull at the end of the film. I feel like a sleek, slightly hunched, combat-ready stance would have suited this character splendidly, but sadly I did not have the time to rig or pose. During this pre-production phase, I also started to think about what parts of the sculpt would be easier to 3D model in Maya as hard surface objects rather than sculpted. The obvious outliers were the metal parts of the mask, which included the goggles and the gas mask nozzle. If I were to sculpt these, the process would be so delicate and would take me far longer to finish than if I modelled them. After I had a clear vision for how I wanted my character to look and what parts needed to be sculpted, I moved to the blockout phase in ZBrush. Blockouts can be approached in various different ways, by doing pieces individually or as one full body blockout using Z-spheres. Z-spheres are a very easy way to get shapes you want by dragging spheres from other spheres to create shapes, which is incredibly handy for things such as hands. In the beginning, I planned to do the Hydra Soldier in separate parts, which was a different way to how I did my first ever sculpt in year 1. However, I opted to go to the Z-sphere route for swiftness, as I find using Z-spheres less tedious than making individual parts of a character. If I could go back and change anything about my blockout process, I likely would have left the boots out of my Z-sphere blockout, as I wasn't too happy with the quality of them in the final stages. I could have got to a better resolution, shaping, and form if I did them separate, and this is something to keep in mind for the future. I then started to get the basic forms for the leather jacket, pants, gloves, and helmet to an early stage, with the primary focus on the helmet. I think I did a decent job at getting the weighted feel of the leather jacket accurate, as I've worked with heavy material sculpting before in year 1. At first, the leather straps and belts as a part of the harness were sculpted onto the jacket itself, but I was not happy with the quality as time went on, so I opted to switch these out for separate objects for better quality. After I got my basic shapes, I focused heavily on getting the helmet correct. The helmet is the most eye-catching part of the Hydra Soldier, as well as the most detailed, so getting it right was important to me in the development process. I masked off some parts of the side of the helmet, inverted the mask, and then pulled them inside to create the illusion that these were separate pieces, using the damn standard inverted tool to really sharpen some of those edges and make it feel layered. When it came to the goggles and the gas mask parts of the mask, I extruded the mask inwards to leave some space where I would place the nozzle, and simply left the area where no detail would be needed to be applied at the goggles as plain as I could. Eventually I reached the stage where I was very happy with just how nice the helmet was taking shape, with the sculpted rivets and folds in the leather looking absolutely beautiful. I then moved away from ZBrush for a short while and modelled both the goggles and the gas mask nozzle in Maya. This was the difficult part of the creation process, as both components have very bizarre shapes which I found hard to capture. Eventually I found a way to make both of the shapes work, and I was happy with it for the time being, though changes would definitely need to be made later. After importing both components into ZBrush and attaching them to my character, I then decided to work on the pants. First, they appeared a bit too bloated, so I wanted to tone it down and try to get a material definition. I settled on a silky yet weighted feel, which would be assisted by the woven texture I would apply later. I did not feel ready to tackle the boots, so I moved to straightening the harness up. This is where I made the harness an entirely separate piece, using a brush tool and duplicated and cut out version of what I had already made. While the straps looked very nice, the belt could have been done a lot better, with a better process to accompany it. Sadly, I did not have time to think about how else to progress, apart from the process I already did. The boots were next on the list and were rather difficult to do. I have sculpted boots before, but not very well and in a stylized format. Getting the realism was difficult for me, but I attempted to reflect on what I wanted. Some thick, weighty, slightly battered leather boots that had seen some action. After the boots had been done, I moved to the final details of my sculpt. I used a bumpy brush to achieve a fluffy look of the wool covering the neck and the glove entry, and used another brush tool for the wires on the helmet as well as the shoelaces, although this would result in some issues down the line. When it came to retopology, I was short on time using Topogun 2, an alien application I have never in my life used, but I'm thankful I used when I did. I feel Topogun gave me a good understanding of the retopology process and how to properly go about it, and with some trial and error, getting not too many yet not too little polygons into a retopologized sculpt. I used Topogun for the helmet, before porting it over to Maya to fix up any issues and unwrap. I made sure to align the sculpt, which would be baking as my high poly, incredibly accurately to evade any baking issues. When it came to the body, a different approach was required. I was incredibly short on time after a few setbacks, meaning another Topogun retopology was out of the picture. For the sake of time, I Z-remeshed my body and all that was attached to it to reduce the polygon count drastically, so it could be used as a low poly model. When this was done, I got to aligning the two bodies and unwrapping the low poly. On top of this, my wires and shoelaces had not welded properly, and I was left with an abundance of wasted faces and shapes that I would spend hours of my time fixing if I did not redo them as a new object in Maya. While this took some time, I got there in the end. I opted to use different texture sets on my model to make the texturing process in Substance Painter far easier. One for the leather parts of my sculpt, one for the helmet, one for the metal parts, and a few others for the pieces that might be a bit harder to texture on one big set. Smart materials are what I ended up using the most. Some stylized leathers which I edited the colours of and component layers of, as well as a rough and scratched metal for the metal parts, and a visor for the goggle glass. I had to play around with the colour of the goggles after finding some inspiration from a screenshot from one of the Marvel comics, a Hydra soldier wearing these red space-age goggles. The red looked incredible in contrast to the blacks and silvers of the rest of the body, but I wanted to stay faithful to the original look in the films, so I opted to go for the black instead. I used a smart material on the fur parts to accurately resemble the sheepskin look I was going for. I had to play around with the colour and the height of the textures to get a bumpy feel for it. I attached the Hydra logo onto the shoulders of the sculpt to accurately capture their look in the scene from Captain America the First Avenger, and although the jackets don't have any visible buttons or studs, I added some on the shoulders and on the top of the jacket's fold, using my own leather jacket as reference. In the end, I was very happy with how this sculpt turned out, despite having some issues. There were a few minor baking errors, as well as some major ones, such as this weird grid effect on the high poly. It is my belief that this was caused by a lack of smoothing, and was a human error. Perhaps the high poly was a bit too low poly. The reflectivity of the goggles is something that I feel like I could have used some work on too. which is likely an issue derived from the UV unwrap. The goggles would only reflect at certain angles and were not as glossy as I would have liked them to be. Despite this, I am happy with my game ready model and I believe this may be the best sculpt I've ever made.